Hello, welcome back to another episode of this podcast. Today we'll be looking at a governor's race that hasn't been getting much national attention lately, which is my current home state of Kansas. Now, why am I covering Kansas? Well, because I live here. And believe it or not, it is a toss up race basically. So, before I get into that though, I just want to address some things about last episode. That was pretty much a train wreck. So that was a test run, and I noticed the audio was a big issue. Trying to get that figured out. Should be a lot better now, but always looking to improve that. The lighting also not so good. There's just little logistical things that I'll constantly be trying to improve, make the experience better. And if you happen to suffer your way through that, I appreciate that. I did not take pleasure in watching that either. But anyway, that's behind us. So let's move forward with this. So, Kansas. Kansas is strange right now because it is a very red state normally. If you look at the presidential elections, if you look at the elections in the Senate, in the House, it is a deep red state when you look at it that way. So, what happened in 2018 when Laura Kelly, the Democrat, won the race? And there are some things that happened. So, I think the most prominent reason would be Sam Brownback, the previous governor, who I actually met, but he was very unpopular, about as unpopular of a politician as you can get, basically. His approval ratings were absolutely tanked, and everybody hated him. Democrats, Republicans, Independents. He had no shot. So fortunately for him, that was his second term, so he didn't have to worry about running again. However, that was a problem for the next guy after him, who was Chris Kobach. And so aside from that, I think another reason Republicans had a hard time winning that race was because it was a blue wave year. So that was the midterms, 2 years removed from Donald Trump winning the presidency. That angered a lot of libs. And so there's the blue wave. I think another reason is the very, how would you say, competitive primary in the Republican Party back in 2018. And what I mean by that is if you look at the final results, this was a big issue in those days. I didn't follow it too closely back then, but if you see the percentages here, Kobach beat Jeff Collier by 0.1% practically, which translates to just a few hundred votes. So naturally, they're only separated by a few hundred votes. That is going to raise some issues. Obviously, some people are going to say, are there any shenanigans? I mean, something this close, we should at least have a recount. So the base was very separated back then. So that was another thing. You might have gotten a lot of establishment Republicans detesting Kobach because he was big Trump guy. Very, very based, I think. I like Kobach. And so I think those two things, for the most part, were the main driving forces behind Kelly winning in 2018. Now, I remember that day too. I mean, if you look at the polls for the general election. I mean, I'm a transplant here in Kansas. I wasn't born and raised here. I just immediately assumed every election was going to go Republican way. But, the polls say that it was going to be a really close race. It can go either way. It's just whoever turns out. And since it was a blue wave year, it made sense that the Democrats came out and voted more in volume. So but that night it was just a slow torture, you could say. It started out, Kelly out of the gate, come out hot. And just from there, you were just waiting for the trajectory to just move little by little towards Kobach. And it did, but much too slowly. And it just never got close to happening. So that's what happened in 2018. Now, here's why it could be different this year. First of all, obviously, it's much closer to a red wave year than it's ever going to be to a blue wave year like that year was. That's just common knowledge. It could be a wave, it could be a tsunami, it could just be just a small whatever, something that isn't very consequential, but it is leaning towards Republicans, and not even the most adamant blue Democrat media websites, whoever, can even argue that anymore. So it just depends on how big the wave is. But even if it was a completely even year, which is not going to be, it is a shift in favor of the Republicans than 2018 was. So I think that's a big deal. I think Kelly's going to have to work hard to stave that off. Another thing could be the Brownback Curse. Is that still an issue here? We're 4 years removed from that now. It could be much less of an issue than it was that year. I'm sure there will be some people that still remember, but for the most part, voters don't remember what happened 4 years ago. Another thing is Kobach. Like I said, I like him. He was very strict about the borders. He's just very conservative. And I think he was a Catholic too. I could be wrong. He was too extreme, I guess, for a lot of moderates. That could be another reason why it just either scared people away towards voting for Kelly, voting for the independent, or just not voting at all. Losing those votes is a big deal. Derek Schmidt is more moderate. He's still pretty good. I'm not crazy about him, but he has done some good things as Attorney General. He has fought against the Biden regime a lot, pushed back against the mandates. So he has done some pretty good things about Attorney General, as the Attorney General. And of course, what's funny is this year, it's now Schmidt running for governor and Kobach running for Attorney General. So hopefully this is the right way this time. But he is more moderate, and I think that is going to bring in more moderate voters, which I think Kansas does have more of. I think we have a lot of fiscal conservatives here in the state. So when you get a guy like Kobach, who is very, very conservative on social issues, it's probably a turnoff for a lot of these people. Schmidt, while he's still pretty good on these things, is just a lot more laid back about it, I guess. And then I think another thing that hurt Kobach last year was the third party. So Greg Orman was the independent that year. He got 6.5% of the vote. He has a tendency to overperform as compared to just just other independents. 6.5% is pretty good for that. And I know back in 2014 when he ran against Pat Roberts in the Senate, that was not even a Republican versus Democrat race. It was Republican versus Independent, and the Independent was Orman, and he got, I think, over 40% of the vote. So he knows how to siphon Republican votes away from the Republican as an independent. And that, you do the math. You take all of his 6.5%, give it to Kobach, and Kobach wins. So he's not here for this race for 2022. The independent for this race is Dennis Pyle, who I like to say Gomer Pyle. He's just, another fake Republican, probably being paid off by the Democrats to take votes away from Schmidt. But he's just not going to be nearly as consequential as Orman was. Now, there are a few things going for Kelly as well. Namely, she's an incumbent, and not just because she's an incumbent, but because she's an incumbent in Kansas. And historically, I don't think, maybe there's been one time or another, but pretty much the incumbent in Kansas does not lose. So that is history that's not on our side. Now, she also has a very solid approval rating. Could just be people just say, yeah, whatever, sure. Could be polling error, I don't know. But that is something hard to beat. It's certainly a lot more solid than Brownback's was. But at the end of the day, it is Kansas. Hopefully turns around. And then I think this could go either way. This could be a double-edged sword, but the abortion vote that happened back in August, it was overwhelmingly, unfortunately, in favor of keeping abortions going. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but in a nutshell, that's what it is. So you could say that's momentum for the Democrats. They're going to build off of that and be even more just ready to go and vote. But it could also go the other way around. It could be that they said, all right, this is the one. We wanted to win this one. We're not as concerned about what happens after that. This was the thing we wanted. And Republicans could say, all right, maybe it's a wake-up call. Maybe they're saying, all right, now we need to start taking this seriously again. We can't start letting the state spiral out of control and become more and more Democrat. Just can't happen. So it really can go either way. I hope that it can go the Republican way, but we'll see. Another thing I wanted to address here. Now, where it was in 2018, we have. Yeah, I want to see this map. This is a map showing how much support Orman got in that election. And then I wanted to also pull up the 2020 election in Kansas. And I wanted to use this map because it just correlates better. It's kind of will throw you off if you look at this map and these two maps, because it just doesn't work out that way. I can't explain it, but just believe me, it's better this way that I show the presidential map. You can see that if we look at some of the counties that he got a lot of support in, so you could see, over 16%, 14, 16%, so the darker it is, the more support he got. Western Kansas, he got a lot more. As you can see, Republicans rely on Western Kansas a lot for their votes. which means that Orman probably took a lot more votes away from the Republican than he did the Democrat. It's all hypothetical. I don't know for sure, but I believe that's what's going on there. And then one last thing. Now let's look at some of the presidential elections in Kansas that happened. So, look at this. There's been one a Democrat that's been voted president in Kansas since 1936. How often does that happen? Well, once in every, 80 something years when LBJ won. But in 2016, Trump won by about 20 points, 2021. In 2020, he only won by 15 points. So Democrats could be saying, yep, it's trending blue. Next election, maybe the Republican will only win by 10. But there are a few reasons I think you could say it's shifted about 5%. States are shifting all the time, but Hillary was, already really unpopular as it is, but she was especially unpopular in the Midwest, in the rural areas where Kansas is right in the middle of. So I think that worked in Trump's favor. Trump was just not super popular in Kansas. As you recall, he also lost the Republican primary to Ted Cruz back in 2016, or it might have been 2015, but in that election cycle. And so the fact that he still won by 20 here says quite a bit about both sides. 2020 kind of makes sense too, because Biden, with his fake, moderate old Joe persona, was effective in shifting some of the rural voters slightly more towards blue. They're still red, but more towards blue. As you can see, Trump was pretty much dead even both years. He had just as much of the vote. I think this shift is just a difference between Hillary and Biden, not necessarily that Kansas is shifting more blue. Hopefully I'm wrong. Or hopefully I'm not wrong. Sorry. And so at the end of the day, I try to stay optimistic with these elections. Kansas has been hard to, especially with that abortion vote, especially that it was such a landslide. Hopefully that can be chalked up to a lot of conservatives here being just your typical moderate whatever. They don't really care much about the social issues. So maybe they didn't go out to vote, or they just voted, didn't care which way or the other. And I think that's about everything. So Kansas is close. I want to say I think Schmidt's going to win, but I really couldn't tell you if he is or not.